We are pleased to be joined by Michael Reich, a PhD economist and professor at UC Berkeley, who has done extensive work on a federal minimum wage increase to $20, as well as some of the effects on the state level, of which we're excited to get into and discuss. But first, I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Of course, yeah, the pleasure's all ours. So we really do want to get into discussing some of the downstream effects of minimum wage, but first, kind of to talk about the scope, roughly how many workers would this affect and what sort of overall increase would be estimated?
So I have looked at what would it take and what would be in the effects of raising the federal minimum wage to $20. It's now $7.25, but hardly anybody gets paid that anymore. It's maybe 1% of the workforce. So the lowest wage that we see in any numbers is more like $10 or $12 an hour, and that's in the lowest cost southern states. And my proposal is to raise the minimum wage from its current level in increments to $20 in 5 years by 2030, and then to go even farther to $25 by 2035. And the motivation for this is that it costs a lot more, not less than $7.25 or even $15 to live in the United States. And for example, in our lowest cost state and lowest wage state like Arkansas and Mississippi, $20 an hour would be enough to support a single adult without a kid living on their own. It's more like $25 if you are two working parents with two kids. So I also want to create other benefits for working families like child support, universal child care, and so on. But it's about time to have the minimum wage be a living wage. The question is whether it's economically feasible. Because what you're going to do is you're going to raise the minimum wage or raise the wage for about 40 million workers. That would be about a quarter of the whole workforce. They each would get an $8,000 increase. That's a 30% increase. That's a lot of money. So, they'd have more to spend, and that would help the economy. But what would be the effect on businesses, if I may turn to that?
Sure.
You could imagine, because businesses will certainly say, well, if we had to pay $20 an hour, our hamburgers would cost $40, or instead of $4. And we wouldn't be able to sell any hamburgers and we'd go out of business. And it is true that employers will pass on their minimum wage increase in part through higher prices. But there are also other effects. It turns out that our lowest wage employers have very high turnover rates among their workers. That is, a lot of people leave every month and they have to constantly hire to replace them, and they never hire enough. They always have a lot of openings, a lot of vacancies. So the labor market doesn't work like it's supposed to. And if you ever took an introductory economics course, and somehow the price is supposed to be set so that the market clears and the quantity supplies the quantity demanded, that's not true in a lot of markets, and certainly not true in the labor market. So what a high minimum wage would do, it would encourage workers to stay longer at the jobs they have, and it would also mean more would apply to those jobs. The employers would have an easier time recruiting workers as well as retaining them, and that would absorb a lot of the cost of the increased minimum wage. The second point I'd make is that labor costs are only a partial share of overall costs in even a very labor-intensive industry like fast food. So if you hear the minimum wage is going to go up 25%, it doesn't mean prices are going to go up 25%, because labor costs are only about a third of overall costs in restaurants. And also, not everyone is when there's a minimum wage increase, was getting the old minimum wage increase. Some people were getting more than the minimum. And so when you put all that together, you get a much smaller price increase than you'd expect. So California recently raised its minimum wage for fast food chains from $16 to $20. And wages went up, not by $4, not by 25%, but they went up. Prices, as far as we can tell, went up only about 1 or 2%. And that's relative to prices in other states where there were also fast food workers. So it's a attempt to not just say, well, what actually happened to prices, but what was the effect of the minimum wage on prices, which is a narrower question. So 1.5% or 2%, that's like 4 cents or 8 cents, I guess, on a $4 hamburger. Most consumers can afford that, and it's not going to put businesses out of business, and they haven't been.
And then you also discuss some of the other positive effects kind of you can see downstream from minimum wage, like increases in government revenue, like reducing the deficit in the Social Security fund. Could you describe some of these also?
Yeah, well, the more important downstream effects are on kids and on the ability of parents to deal with emergencies, have less stress in their lives, and they're better parents. There's a lot of good studies showing that as a result. And kids get more education, and they're healthier. It's also been found that minimum wage increases improve credit ratings quite a lot. So if a a family wants to borrow money to get a car, if they don't have a car or they need to replace an old car, they're going to get a better rate as a result. So those are kind of important. What you're referring to, and which I've been working on more recently, is that when the minimum wage would go up all the way to $20, then people who pay income taxes and uh, payroll taxes for Social Security and Medicare, those funds are going to go up too, and by quite a lot, by tens of billions of dollars. And then on the other side, there are a lot of people who qualify for our means tested programs like food stamps, for example. Uh, and those programs are intended for people who are poor, who can't even make a poverty level of standard of living. And but they tend to phase out. They phase out when pay goes up. Um, so a minimum wage of $20 would phase out a lot of those food stamp recipients. Is that a good thing? Well, it not only saves the taxpayers money, but I think most people would rather pay for their groceries out of their earnings rather than from a government fund.
And you talked about prices and kind of how it's, I think you said 8 cents for a $4 hamburger. I think
Yeah,
or some of the other pushbacks that people might give are things like employment. Does it lower, like hours or those kinds of things? Did you find any of these effects in
yeah,
your research, or what did you come up with in those findings?
yeah. Again, I've done studies showing what the effects were when California and New York State went up to $15 a few years ago over a 7-year period from $8. And more recently, I've looked at this fast food minimum wage to $20 in California. And in both cases, we find what people have found with minimum wage levels a lot lower, but minimum wage increases, that there's no job effect. Uh, and this seems contrary to what you might think. I mean, if labor costs go up, wouldn't employers want to buy, fewer workers or hire fewer workers? And again, you have to recognize that employers um, are stuck when they pay low wages. They pay low wages because it's profitable to them, but then they also have a high employee turnover. And so that means that they can't hire all the workers they want to. And what a higher minimum wage does is it actually makes it possible for them to hire more workers. So we find some effects of positive effects, not negative effects, but mainly I would say mainly we don't find much. Even the positive effects are small. So that's employment. You asked about hours, and here there's fewer studies because the hours measurements in our surveys are very crude, because most people say, they work 40 hours or 20 hours or 30. They round it off.
Mhm.
Um, that's reasonable, that's understandable, but it means that we have these big spikes at even numbers, and so we're not, the data aren't always as uh, useful for us. They're pretty noisy in terms of what the effects are on hours. But what studies there are, and some with better data that come from other sources than surveys, like from payroll data, we don't find any decrease in hours either. And for the same reason that now a hamburger, burger restaurant now can sell more burgers, and it needs more workers, not fewer workers.